I think we should take some questions. I hope we should.
Mine I think is going to embarrass myself, so I can't think of it's a very stupid question yet. So if it is, everybody just laugh, and I'm kidding. And this might just because of my own ignorance. So not to linger on it, but so my family didn't fare so well during the Holocaust, and as a result, I kind of have a very biased perspective, I think, on what human rights is all about. But it strikes me as interesting that the emphasis in your talk on universality, in part because the Holocaust really isn't so much of a universal event, right? At least in the sense that if you conceive of human rights from the perspective of a persecuted group as opposed to as a persecuted individual, then you end up with the question. I always call it the Hitler versus Stalin, right? It's like, well, one kills, so many Russians die under Stalin, but Hitler just seems more evil to me. And I'm just kind of wondering whether or not the fact that Jews and the experience of the Holocaust shaped the evolution of human rights law internationally, whether or not that has had a limiting factor on the universality, at least in the sense that the focus is, or to the extent that the focus is or might be, on the universality of groups rather than the universality of rights within a single individual. Because it seems to me strange to say that the individual's rights are equal and universal for all individuals, but that, I guess in a strictly utilitarian sense, somebody who kills 100 million is not necessarily worse or whatever, or more condemnable than somebody who targets even 100 people, but specifically because they're Jews or because they're black or that are whatever. Does that make sense? Is that stupid? Should we all laugh?
No, but I mean it's written more a comment than a question, isn't it?
Well, I think the question was just do you think it has, or to what extent do you think there is an element of, to what extent do you think that in addition to contributing, we've shaped it in a way that limits its ability to see beyond groups, or is that the case, or do you feel not so? I guess it is really more of a amusing, I guess.
No.
That's right.
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is now the sort of the more legalistic, although I think it's quite accessible to people who aren't specialists in law. But there's a debate. You have the minorities treaties that follow the First World War, and that's sort of the model for protection of vulnerable groups and individuals is protect the minority, the rights of the minority. And when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is adopted, that idea is kind of dropped. There's actually a lot of dissatisfaction with the minorities treaties. They don't work very well. They obviously didn't help the Jews too much in Europe. They certainly didn't save them. But it's more the vision as to whether you do better by protecting minorities as groups with specific legal provisions, or whether you go for an equality-based vision of human rights, where just everybody's equal. So instead of focusing on the groups, you just say the individuals are equal and they're to be free from discrimination. And that's the view that's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It doesn't have anything on minorities. The debate still goes on in human rights law and human rights circles about which vision is better. And I always think it's also it goes on in the individual as well, because in every individual who's in a situation where they may be victimized as a result of discrimination in some form or another, they make a decision as to whether they're going to do better or whether they prefer to have strength in their group or whether they just want to be treated equally. And people make individual decisions about that. I don't even want to make a value judgment about which one is better. I just think that within groups, within families, people come to different conclusions about it. And so human rights does this as well. You have the one vision, which is the one in the Universal Declaration, to which Cassin in particular contributes, and maybe it's particularly French as well. It's the idea that you're in a state that is a secular state, but that all religious groups and minorities and individuals are respected as equals, but that there are no carve-outs either for different groups with special circumstances. That's the theory of it, and that's the sort of French Republican view, and Cassin is very committed to that. And then there's the other vision, which is protect the rights of a community and of a minority and so on. As I say, I'm not judgmental about which one is better, but I'm struck by the fact that two sisters or two brothers in the family, one will opt for one vision and the other will opt for another, as we all know.
Could you have both, though? I mean, in the United States, we have protected classes, so to speak, which would be religion, race would be another. We also have the Bill of Rights,
Which would
indicate some basic human rights, which would be a basis for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, certainly. And, I mean, are they mutually exclusive? Why?
No, they're not. And of course, the American Bill of Rights is one of at the root of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you find the American Bill of Rights. And of course, it doesn't have a vision of equality at the beginning. That only comes later. It comes after the Civil War, doesn't it? And you get the equality provisions in the Bill of Rights, and then they don't have any teeth in them because the Supreme Court doesn't use them to bite for about another 100 years.
Should have gone with the Declaration of Independence.
It's better.
Yeah, a strong first line.
Yeah.
They opened well on that.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about the challenges in trying to implement this conception of human rights in practice. I guess as a species, a more general case of international law, or more general issue of international law. It seems as if there are governments that may be repressive and persistently violate the human rights of their subjects or citizens, but if those governments are strong and not subject to some kind of international pressure, there isn't really going to be an opportunity to raise these kinds of questions or do investigations about whether human rights have been violated. In some cases, those investigations happen only after those governments have fallen or when those governments are weak or when we're talking about things that cross over state boundaries. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about these sorts of limits and how that has impacted on the original conception of the people who are talking about human rights.
If we compare the contemporary mechanisms within the United Nations and within other bodies as well for the protection of human rights, it's a huge, elaborate, complex system compared to what you had in the 1940s. I mean, when these three men are working on their various projects at the end of the Second World War, there's nothing. There's a Nuremberg trial. That's it. And when the United Nations starts operating, you have clauses in the Charter of the United Nations that talk about protecting human rights almost immediately. We know this, we can find the documents. I've done research in the archives and seen them. People start writing to the UN, to the Secretary General or just, United Nations, New York City, saying, I'm being persecuted, here's the problem, do something. And for the first year or two, I actually found a memo in the Canadian archives from the Canadians were getting these complaints about various human rights abuses, and they didn't know what to do. So some bureaucrat in the Canadian ministry said, well, I know who to ask. We'll ask the United States. They know. And they wrote a letter to, they had their ambassador or their diplomat in Washington go and meet the head of the UN desk, who was a guy named Dean Rusk, who goes on to be, I guess, Secretary of State, right? And he's the head of the UN desk in 1947. And Dean Rusk says, well, you want to know what to do with these things? He says, you can file them in the waste basket, that's it. Because you don't have to do anything with them, and that's what we're doing. We're not doing anything. And so the Canadians write back, say, well, we don't have to do anything. And I said, that's good. And I saw it on the files and all of this. But slowly, systems develop. And they are, like everything in the United Nations, played by the politics of the institution. And so you have things that develop on different tracks, things that are more immune to the political factors and others that are vulnerable to the political factors. And as the system grows, that those problems, they remain in a way. But, today we have a mix. So, just to talk very briefly about commissions of inquiry, we have issues about setting up commissions of inquiry where they require enough of the stars to line up politically for that to take place. And that means that for some people, some countries, there'll never be a commission of inquiry. I did a lot of work in the last few years on Sri Lanka and on the end of the conflict with the Tamil Tigers. There's no commission of inquiry. Just can't get it through. You can't get it through. And that's just, hopefully things will change. And in some cases things do change and they evolve to make it more, so there's less of this double standard within the United Nations. I'm not going to speak about any more specific examples. At the same time, you have places, and this is one of the great accomplishments actually in recent years, that are very egalitarian in that everybody gets treated more or less the same. So now you have a mechanism that's only existed since 2008, called the Universal Periodic Review, where every state in the United Nations, every single one, has to do a report every 4 years before the Human Rights Council, and then they get grilled by a committee, and all the countries send their diplomats there, and they have these debates about their performance. And it's the first time in the UN you've had this. Before you had this idea that you could focus energy on a country if you could get the political momentum, and they would do things like create something called a special rapporteur or something like that. You could also deal with the country if they had accepted certain treaties. And some countries, the really bad countries, hadn't accepted any of the treaties, or they'd accepted them partially. And even some of the good countries had only accepted some of the treaties and not all of them. So the United States, take an example of a country that's has a mixed record in international human rights. The United States ratifies the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which deals with free speech and freedom of religion and so on. It doesn't ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which deals with the right to work and to medical care and to housing and so on. Double standard, but it's their choice. And China, see, it's almost the flip side. China ratifies the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, won't ratify the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, where they would be responsible for torture, the death penalty, stuff like that. Amazing thing starts to happen in about 2009 when they start presenting their reports to the Human Rights Council. This is not them being grilled by other countries, but it's as if they understand now that they are as well. China starts reporting on the death penalty, on torture, on the issues that it never had even accepted the idea that the UN could exercise jurisdiction before. And the United States comes before the Human Rights Council and says, we're here to talk about human rights in the United States. And what do they talk about? Housing, medical care, and education, the economic and social rights. So that's had a great leveling effect. And all of the countries are there. And of course, they have their friends and their enemies, Egypt likes to come to the Human Rights Council and congratulate countries on the fact that they still have the death penalty and urges them to use it more than they do. So you get some of that. But by and large, everybody gets to participate in the discussion. So there are places where you have more of that, which I'm sure was exactly the vision of, to go back to my talk, of Lagerbeck and Cassin and Lemkin. That's what they would have dreamt of. It took 65 years to get even to that point. But it's a work in progress. So it's a system that sometimes treats everybody equally and other times doesn't. It's like Churchill said about democracy, it's the worst system, except for all the others. So.
Good question, Ray. Sorry, I'm kind of hiding behind. Building off of that discussion, I'm wondering, with looking at all of these human rights treaties, just international, public international law in general, do you see it as an absolute system, or are there sometimes circumstances looking kind of a means to ends framework in different national interests? Because nowadays we can all see examples of countries that are, we would call bad governments generally, that use international human rights law to distort the conversation and to try to put blame in places that it shouldn't be. And then you sometimes have generally good governments that we see getting in trouble for international law provisions. And so are there circumstances in which the documents that we have should not be taken as absolute standards, in which the circumstances really need to take precedent, like in geopolitical conflict?
Well, human rights law, of course, is part of the whole idea of human rights law is that that the rights are balanced, and there are limitations on rights that are permitted, and so it's a flexible system that takes into account different factors. There are some things that are considered absolute that, by the way, 50 years ago people might have said, "Well, come on, torture we have to be able to do it sometimes." I think there are probably people here in this country who still think that. People in the former administration here probably think that occasionally torture is necessary and the ends justify the means. But I think that that's not the position of the current government, thankfully. And but we're still debating about some of those points even then. But there are some things that we've ruled out that we'll say they're never permissible, they're never justifiable. Racial discrimination, could you ever have an exception to that? But then can you have exceptions to freedom of expression? Yes. Can you have exceptions to detention without trial? Yes, under certain circumstances. And there's a huge amount of law in all of this. The other thing about the sort of the double standards and everything, because you talk about, countries that are basically good, and this sort of dichotomy of the countries that are basically good and the countries that are basically bad. There's some goodness in all of the countries, and there's some badness in all of them too. I've never been. It's just my nature. I've never liked the idea of being a sort of. I call myself a European. I know that won't be one of. It's not a language. Maybe it's not the way people talk here in the United States, but Western. That's my background. And I never liked the idea that I'm just going to be there to lecture countries in Africa and Asia about how to behave better, without first looking at our behavior. So that's just my nature, is to want to deal with that as well. But there are different degrees of problems. It's a global project to improve human rights. Everybody can improve, and the issues are different. I don't know if that answers your question.
But
and I should be clear again. I studied philosophy and religion. I have no expertise or even background relating to international law. But you're probably familiar with a work by Samuel Moyn, an intellectual historian at Columbia, called The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History. And this sort of picks up with your lecture, sort of the after the 48, in which Moyn argues particularly that the regime we now think of as the human rights regime is very recent, actually dating to the 70s, and that the earlier iterations of human rights language did very different things. In the middle 20th century, for example, largely supported national self-determination. And that the current regime has to do with the decline of a lot of the then utopian ideas like Marxism, the current vogue of human rights internationally, and the very wide appeal to it. And he mentions that he thinks a lot of the authority of human rights comes in principle from the impartiality, the universality, and that he, at least as I understand it, worried a great deal about their politicization as undermining the actual authority that human rights are supposed to have. And so in the Human Rights Council, just as an example, I understand the debates are very complicated about what grounds international law when you don't have a direct sovereign to enforce it and these sorts of things. But when you have such, for example, market disproportionality in the attention focused on different countries, a disproportionality which is quantitative and in that sense not disputable, it seems like it can undermine or render to an outsider, give you a basis for a cynical view of the way in which human rights can often be deployed, not just for political means, but consistently to represent and enforce particular national or cultural ideologies So I'm wondering, one, what do you think of Wayne's argument and sort of how it plays in the international rights world? And then two, do you think there is something to this, where even if human rights maintain a juridical validity, by being so politicized, they can actually lose public authority? People can become very cynical, and I mean that seems to be even very part of the current controversy.
Yeah. The second point, I'm not going to argue with you about that, because it's a great concern for me as well. I want to make it very clear. I want everybody to be treated fairly and equally in human rights, and it is a great concern that the double standards, the idea that some people are going to be picked on and others are going to be sheltered, it discredits it. I totally agree, and that's what, So, there are two ways of dealing with a situation like that. One is you say, we're going to fight to work that out of the system, and the other is you turn your back on it, and that's just, different people will react differently to that, I suppose. But I'm not arguing with you at all about the threat that poses to the credibility of the system. Absolutely true, and I think that's widely acknowledged. When the reforms were made to the human rights system about a decade ago, they were proposed by Kofi Annan and the Secretary General of the UN. They were endorsed by Louise Arbour, who was the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I said, look, this has discredited this system because we've got to fix it. But finally, it was hard to fix by just creating another political organ, because the political organ will represent the world, finally. And that's one of the constant complaints about the Human Rights Council. I think some countries would think the Human Rights Council will only be good if every country, to get in, you have to basically come from Northern Europe. But that's not going to be credible either. So the problem is, it's got to represent the world. It's got to represent the world. The whole world's got to be there for the system to work globally, and that means that you can't have rules that say, well, only good countries from Northern Europe get to be members of it or something. That's the problem with trying to find a solution to it. But there is no solution to it. But Samuel Moyn, I was thinking about that. You haven't had him here?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Can you please email him and tell him to come?
Well, I never met Samuel Moyn.
That's how you meet him.
Yeah, I know. I'd like to meet him. I think we've come close a couple of times at conference. I'd like to meet him. I'm fascinated by his book. There's a lot of sense in it. Basically, his book that he came out with called The Last Utopia, about 3 or 4 years ago. It's been, making lots of waves in it. He would say to me, "Oh, you get too excited about the 1940s." If he was sitting here tonight, he'd be saying, "Oh, nothing happened in the 1940s. Why are you so excited about Lauterpacht and Lemkin and Cassin and all of that, and Eleanor Roosevelt?" I'm a big member of the Eleanor Roosevelt fan club. He doesn't think much of Eleanor Roosevelt either. Okay. And his theory is that the human rights starts in the 1970s. And he cites as examples Amnesty International is then, rolling along. They get the Nobel Peace Prize. Jimmy Carter's the president. It's a little too much of an Americo-centric view of human rights for my liking. It's kind of like it all starts with Jimmy Carter, which I think is, and it's too dismissive of this fascinating period, I think, this really seminal period in the 1940s, which is, to be fair, it's a standard-setting phase rather than an operational phase, and that takes long. But the metaphor I use, it's do you do this here? You plant your tulip bulbs in the autumn, and then they sit there in the earth, right, for about 3 months, or maybe longer here in England. They're out by the middle of January, and they're starting to pop out. But you plant things and then you wait, and I think the Universal Declaration was like that. They planted something. It was, I think, these very perceptive, brilliant people. And I named some of them. I don't want to say they were all Jews, because they weren't, but the Jews were important. Eleanor Roosevelt, at a time when lots of people in the 1940s, they were saying, "Oh no, I'm not going to waste my time with it. What's this human rights thing? I'm going to do something else." And I think it was quite brilliant on their part. And as I tried to explain, it came from their background and their worldview. Eleanor Roosevelt was probably more driven by women's equality, and also her strong commitment here in the United States to the end of racial discrimination. And they came up with this marvelous document, but then it was like putting the bulbs in the earth. It sat there covered with snow and dead leaves for 3 or 4, for a couple of decades. So I don't know. I don't. Probably Moyne and I, if we were here, we'd agree on 95% of the things, and we could find. I'm a great compromiser. We could find stuff. Shmuley and I chatted we agreed on everything today, didn't we?
Yeah.
So, I mean, how flexible can I be? And so we. I think we'd agree on most of it. I don't think he has to dismiss the 40s to make his case for this fabulous period in the 1970s when the international human rights system finally starts rolling.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Samuel? We're talking about Samuel and not Samuel, so just to put the 3 Sams in the same. But Professor Schabas, don't you think that if we were honest about the concentration, the reality is that I don't think many of us would argue about the concentration of the violation of human rights today is fairly geographical. We can sort of point to certain regions in the world where most of the violations of human rights are being committed. And if you represent, talk about as this European and the academic intellectual world, and as you being at the forefront of this crusade to really stop. So the 40s period, the 70s period, and maybe we're talking now, there's the 21st century. That if we were honest and turned to that region of the world, we being the West and maybe Europe and your academic world, and said there's going to be zero tolerance. You're not going to be on a committee or part of a League of Nations that's going to be able to fight human rights until you actually stop your own violation of human rights, and really confronted those countries. And I don't have to name them, but they're some in Asia, most in the Middle East, and even Africa. That we would actually make some rapid changes, and it requires, I think, a certain bravery, a courage, and demands real conviction. And maybe that's a great task. I mean, if I was forming a rabbinical committee, or I was forming a real estate commission, or I was forming a medical league of professionals, I would look at the backgrounds of the people on any one of those, and I could go on and on and on, and say, what do you really represent? Who are you? What do you do? And where do you come from? If you're a child molester, I probably wouldn't put you on a medical commission. If you're in the demolition business, I don't think I really want to think of you as somebody on a real estate board. And so maybe, maybe there is more that can be done by people like yourself in the places of power that you are, by really confronting going back. When I look at some of these commissions, and I look at the nations that are listed and the commas between them, and they're sort of a parallel, and then I look at the ones that are pro, against, it's unbelievable how, you can really define them, and you can almost guess who's going to be there. So I'm curious as to the extent to which you think those that's a fair proposal for real change today, considering the fact that it's clear who the violators are, who the victims are, and unfortunately, sadly, in many cases, it's people killing people of their own backgrounds. In so many cases, so I'm just
in my own professional life, in the last decade or so, the countries that I've been most involved in, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Burma, and Sierra Leone. So, it's not as if I spend my whole time bashing the UK and the United States, and, but at the same time, when I go out there and they say, well, wait a minute, but why are you picking on us? Because this thing cuts both ways, this argument. And they say, why are you picking on us? Well, look at the United States. I'll give you an example of the United States since we're here. Let me just, key on my host,
Well, how many of us are not from the United States in the room? Just I know we have some international students. Just so, okay.
There is one of the very
Sorry, I
exciting,
want to see a green card. Just kidding.
very exciting development in the last few years is results from a judgment of the International Court of Justice dealing with the Torture Convention, which is one of the key international human rights conventions, was filed by Belgium against Senegal. Okay, so big Belgium has a long-standing relationship with Africa, not always very joyful, responsible for some of the initial crimes against humanity when they were colonizing the Congo. But now they're, wonderful Northern European, everything is correct that they do. And so they go after Senegal because Senegal has provided a refuge to a former dictator of Chad named Hissène Habré. Hissène Habré gets thrown out of power, goes to Senegal, and Senegal protects him. And Belgium says, you ratified a torture convention, you're supposed to prosecute him for torture. And if you don't prosecute him, you're supposed to send him to us because we'll prosecute him for torture. And Senegal says, no, I don't think we're going to do this. And so Belgium sues Senegal at the International Court of Justice. And the International Court of Justice says to poor little Senegal in Africa, you lose. You violated the torture convention. You'd better either prosecute him or send him back to Belgium. And little Senegal says, okay, we're going to do that. So they're they're internationally lawful. They're abiding by international law. They have a judgment against them. They're doing it, and the trial is ongoing now. They're working on this. There's a Human Rights Watch, the American-based NGO, is very supportive of all this effort. The United States government now is so keen on it and so excited about how good a development it is that they're sending aid. They're sending financial aid to Senegal to help run the trial. The American ambassador for war crimes issues, Stephen Rapp, is a good friend of mine. He's doing support there. He's going there. He's sending experts. The husband of the woman on the Gavin Commission, Mary Davis, her husband Fred Davis, was a big shot New York lawyer. He's going off to Senegal to do training for the people there, for victims' lawyers and everything in the case. So this is great. This is human rights law at work. But here in this country, you had cases of torture that were committed in the early part of the last decade with regard to prisoners. I mean, I'm not making this up. The president admitted it. When Obama came in, he said, we committed torture. It's going to stop now. Okay? And I think there were changes that were made. I believe that. You can see it in that film. Many of you have seen the Zero Dark 30, where the woman who's the hero of the film, she says, well, you can't torture people anymore. And then she figures out how to find Osama bin Laden using intelligent policing and detective work, and finally solves the problem. Whereas, waterboarding people actually doesn't make it, they don't make any progress, waterboarding people. So this is the position of the U.S. And Obama said, because I'm going to stop praising Obama now, because I'm praising him for condemning the torture and acknowledging it. And he says, but we're not going to prosecute anybody for it. Okay? That's the position. So how do you explain that to somebody in Sri Lanka, or in Sierra Leone, or in Burma, when they say, oh, you want to talk about double standards? How about that? The United States is funding the trial in Senegal. They're giving support to it. They're supporting a judgment of the International Court of Justice, and they're parties to the Torture Convention. So how do they get to say we don't prosecute people for torture? We let them off the hook. And how come Belgium, anybody from Belgium? How come Belgium, which is great at suing African countries, they've been hitting on African countries for 150 years, so they've got lots of experience, and so they go after little Senegal. So why don't they go after the big guy? Why don't they go after the United States? Say, come on, come to the International Court of Justice. We'll have a debate with you as well, because you're doing the same thing. You don't want to prosecute the guys who were responsible for the waterboarding in Afghanistan? Okay, send them to us in Belgium. And they don't do it, because the United States will say, well, you want to keep the NATO headquarters in Belgium? Stop doing that to us. I'm just saying there's lots of double standards in this system. And, I travel around the world, so I don't just argue with people in the United States about double standards. I argue with them in Burma and Sri Lanka. Well, I can't go into Sri Lanka anymore. I can't go into Burma anymore. I'm gradually eliminating countries where I can visit. Pretty soon it'll just be London and Paris and the United States. Maybe even the United States they'll probably kick me out. But I'm just saying about the double standards are there, but we've got to be better here to win that argument in a convincing way with the countries in the South. Because we do want to improve human rights. We've got the same thing in the country where I live now, the UK. We've got this problem where they have judgments. We have a wonderful system in Europe, by the way, the European Court of Human Rights, which deals with human rights violations in all 47 countries in the Council of Europe, including Russia, including lots of nasty countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe where there are huge violations of human rights. And it's great. It's done a huge amount to bring those countries into to make them more democratic, although they're far from perfect, to make them have fairer elections and respect fundamental freedoms and so on, to deal with the overt racial discrimination against Roma and so on that goes on there. But then the British get a judgment against them at the European Court of Human Rights, and they say, oh, we're not going to follow that. So how the hell do we talk to the Russians saying, you got a judgment against you at the European Court of Human Rights, you better respect it, when you have David Cameron say, oh, we're not going to follow that judgment at the European Court of Human Rights. So all of which say, I totally agree with you, this is a problem, but it has many complicated dimensions, and people who are in it just have to say, look, let's push on everybody to make them respect human rights and expose the hypocrisy of one-sided prosecutions wherever they happen.
What's that?
Have you asked a question?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, no, we should go back to a second, but let's get a first for those who haven't asked yet, and then we'll go to the second.
I guess just to go back to your original question, why focus on specific countries other than others? I mean, there's a degree here, though, of human right abuse, waterboarding. I'm not sure of the specifics of the Chad situation, but I'm imagining the numbers are dramatically greater and involve loss of life as opposed to torture. So in terms of a lesser of evils argument, I mean, you have to start somewhere. Shouldn't you start where the most wrong is occurring? I guess, secondly, who is the U.S. to offer its criticism given our own flaws? One leg to stand on would be that we self-identified that torture and said no one had to point out our own flaws. We pointed out our own flaws. That offers you maybe not a higher moral ground, but an area to offer criticism from. Your thoughts on that?
I think I'm just going to be repeating myself. You know, it's hard to weigh things up and say, well, they tortured more people, or they killed them after they tortured them. We didn't kill them. I don't find that very persuasive, really, as an argument. I think you have to do your best and to show you're doing your best to live by the standards, even if the others don't, and that ultimately strengthens your ability to tell them to call them up on their behavior. But every country, there are 193 members of the United Nations, and they've all got problems in some areas, and most of them, you know, there might be a few that I'd be prepared to just put in the total, the dark side, that there's nothing good going on there. I can't really think of anything good in terms of fundamental human rights from Saudi Arabia, for example. Maybe I could, if I thought hard enough about it, I'd come up with something.
We're going to respect the one question first and then go to the second question.
Sure. I will ask my question a little later, but just a little correction. It wasn't self-identification. A lot of videos and photos were leaked from different bases in, say, Iraq and Afghanistan, where these tortures were being done, and then Obama acknowledged that. In terms of, I don't really necessarily want to jump on the bandwagon of trying to diss on the United States. I think it is a great country, but I do agree with the idea that I went to, he didn't quite do the 9-month plan in Israel and Palestine either, but he went to Afghanistan, went against the whole constitution, basically changed it from the ground up. He let a former warlord come into the government, even though he lost the elections, and said, you guys share power 50-50. And even though one guy won it, it's like some countries, say UK, going to the United States in 2000 telling Bush, you and your rival share power. And I thought that was uncalled for, but we could not do anything in that situation. Because the U.S. did threaten removing all aid if we did not deal with that, and sometimes you're just pressured as an underpowered country.
I could somewhat address that point, but not really even diverge afterwards. I'm not exactly sure as to the human rights dimension of the problem that you're getting at. It might be an issue of perhaps state sovereignty, state security. I wanted I definitely
Human rights in the sense of the warlord being allowed to, run the country when
Okay.
he lost.
Okay, I see your point. Sort of to put it in dialogue with the double standard, which I agree is certainly a thing. To what? This is a question, of course, for the professor. To what extent is the top-down approach of diffusing these human rights norms take, say, from the UN to the states themselves? To what? And this is of course redundant because we've addressed a lot of the points. Of course, you simply have to move forward and hope and do what you can. But to what extent is that top-down approach sort of more or less useful in certain contexts than the bottom-up approach in which states themselves undergo the process of infusing these humanitarian rights, and then from there contributing to the international community that way? The most obvious example we presented was the Obama administration sort of reversing its stance on the torture and then coming up to the international community and addressing it. So I see sort of a distinction here between those two methods of approach, and I'd love to hear your comments on it.
I think it's probably there's parts of both that are at work, the top down. I mean, it is one of the problems when you talk about the bad countries is that you're not going to ultimately change the human rights in those countries just by international pressure. It's got to come from within the country as well, and it's not going to work if it's just dictated to them. At the same time, you want to put the pressure on. So I don't know that. I think it's both, and it's finding the pressure and the support for the domestic change is more credible if they feel that they're being pressured by a international community, for want of a better expression, that is relatively free of double standards. So that's going to be more credible. It's all about the credibility of the exercise, I suppose. So we work at both ends. I wouldn't say just favor one as opposed to the other. I think they're both very important. When the UN does this universal periodic review of the countries, you have the other countries where they're, basically turning the heat up on the country, telling them to fix this and this and this and that. But sitting there in the audience are all the local NGOs who have come there, and they take that information and they go back and use it to lobby and do advocacy within the country. So there's a kind of a relationship between the international, the top down, if you want, from the international source, and then the bottom up from within the country.
Professor Harris. Yeah, I'll try to keep the question really brief. So if you try to tell a longer story about the historical genesis of human rights, it seems to me, and I'd be willing to say more about why I think this is the case, that it's very much entangled with the history of monotheistic religion, and so that being the case, my question would be: is there really a non-theistic argument, an intelligible non-theistic argument for basic human equality? And if there is, what does it look like?
So that's stationed. Yeah, I didn't go further back. It's partly because I'm a lawyer, so I tend to be more positivistic. So I'm waiting to see the first article in the text, and so that tends to be the framework that I focus on. Although I don't know that there's any incompatible with my point here. I'm talking about three people from one of the great monotheistic religions who are making their contribution, and they're not atheistic or secular either, any of them, from what I can determine. And I mean, as I said, they're not terribly religious people, it seems, but nevertheless, they're from that background, spiritual, intellectual, however you describe it. It's one of the things I found fascinating reading the drafting documents of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's ultimately it's a secular document. There were suggestions to put religious references into it, and there were some countries that argued for it. They wanted a reference to God. in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that was finally rejected. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights uses language which evokes spiritual or religious notions like human dignity and so on, which is in there. You find the language in there, but without the explicit religious references. And I guess you can view that as well as and to some extent it was a compromise. I know from reading the documents that it wasn't Cassin who wanted the religious references in. They came from the Netherlands and from Brazil. I think they had people in their delegations for whom these were particularly important points. And Malik, I mentioned the negotiators. The two biggest minds, people say, who were involved in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was Shah Malik, an Arab from Lebanon, a Christian, and P.C. Chang, who was Chinese. And apparently they were the smartest people there on the commission, and they disagreed on this. So Malik was a very religious man, and he felt very strongly about having the religious language and within the declaration. And Chang was the opposite. He said, "Look, I'm from China. This doesn't resonate with me, and you've got to make this a universal declaration." So that suggests it's a compromise, and suggests that maybe they even fudged or avoided dealing with the issue. There was an involvement from the UNESCO side. UNESCO was involved in the drafting, and they contributed. The French philosopher Jacques Maritain, who was quite a Catholic, quite a religious person, I think, and he wrote a lot about the Universal Declaration. And he contributed to the debate as well. So maybe it was an unresolved issue that they never finally settled, I guess, depending on your view of the world. And maybe it was the beginning of finding and maybe it's necessary if you're going to have the universal language and the universal view, that you can't be allowing one religious vision to triumph over the other. And there are those who talk about it being the new, it's the religion of the 20th and 21st century is human rights. I don't know if it's really spiritual in that sense, although I did a big lecture, far too complicated to do after dinner, about human dignity, which is a notion that has a lot of religious dimension to it, I suppose. A legal dimension. There's a lot of human dignity in many national constitutions, including the Israeli not the constitution, but whatever it's called, the fundamental. I'm sorry?
Basic law.
The basic law, yeah, the basic law. And a lot of case law on what human dignity is. I sort of waver myself thinking that there's something spiritual about it, because you're talking about the human soul and what's...
It's interesting to note that the Israeli Declaration of Independence also doesn't mention God, and they debated that too at the formation of the state, and they used the word "sor," and even the anthem doesn't have the word God. The Israeli,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the national.
There's a sense in the Declaration. One of the things that very interesting about it is that there's also a notion that people now don't talk about very much in human rights law, about the idea that we're bettering ourselves, that there's something about humanity improving itself. So there's language in there about cultural rights, about education being used to improve ourselves as human beings. There's a line in there about enjoying the arts, which for the people like Cassin and Roosevelt and others, that meant going to concerts and reading poetry and things like that. Now if you talk about cultural rights in the UN, it's all about folklore. It's about, it's anthropological rather than this more... this vision of human beings being on Earth to better themselves, and which can also have a religious side to it, or it can just be a secular view. That's a contribution. It's not my strong point. I'm better on the death penalty than on this, but some thoughts out.
I'll try to keep this brief, but I'll probably say, I was wondering if you could talk at all about the maybe degree of cultural relativism you had to engage in when Sri Lanka and in Burma and these diverse places, especially in a similar vein of that last question, where they didn't really have much of an influence in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And many of the seeds of it might not have been the similar seats that were the core of their cultural and intellectual heritage and history, and whether or not you sometimes felt that you had to compromise some rights in order to achieve a better outcome. Like I can imagine that some people might consider an international court to be illegitimate if the people found guilty of these crimes couldn't be executed, especially if they had the death penalty in their country. And I was wondering if you had any experiences with that you would like to share.
Well, I've been hearing about the cultural relativist debate, the idea that this is a kind of a Western or European creation that then is kind of foisted on a world where it doesn't make sense, and where it's incompatible with cultural traditions. So I've been hearing about it for my whole career, about human rights. I think it was a lot more potent as an argument, a lot more influential 20 years ago than it is today. I think it's lost. My impression is that, well, it's still out there. People still write about it from time to time, and you hear about it occasionally, that it's lost a great deal of the momentum it had 20 years ago. And that the standards in things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are now increasingly recognized as being universal, which I think they are. It was an argument that was trotted out mainly by tyrants in countries like Malaysia and stuff, and Iran, to say, well, we can't, this is just Western values. It's far less important. I mentioned because let me. I don't know how much longer we're going to go. Julie, you're probably sick of hearing from me.
Your breakfast, I think, is at 8. We'll cut whenever you're ready. Whenever you.
I've alluded to it a couple of times. The subject that I was my doctoral thesis, and something that I continue to work a great deal on, is the issue of capital punishment and the abolition of the death penalty. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, almost every state in the world had capital punishment in executing people. Today, there are less than 40 states out of 190 odd that still use the death penalty. And even those 40 states that use it, the United States is one of them, we see dramatic declines in the use of it. And this is, it's a central human rights issue. It's something they argue about when they're adopting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a fabulous success story. And it's a very universalistic one as well. There are developed countries that still have the death penalty, the United States in particular, but also Japan. And there are very, very undeveloped states in Africa that have abolished it, like Rwanda. And it doesn't fit with a vision that's related to stages of development or even geography. It's disappeared in the Western Hemisphere. It's gone now with this exception, the United States, and of course you don't have it in Connecticut, right?
We did out 2 years ago.
Yeah, but you didn't execute anybody in Connecticut.
Well, there are still people who may be executed because they committed their crimes while the death penalty was in place.
It's not going to.
Oh, it might.
Really?
No, it might. I mean, with the Cheshire home invasion cases, I think it will. But that's a matter of dispute.
People are always afraid that it's going to come back with vigor, but it doesn't. I've been tracking this for more than 20 years. Of course, never say never. Anything can happen. But it is something that it actually continues to improve generally. So I'm almost too relaxed about it now. Say, don't worry, it won't happen. But even in the countries, I say China, the death penalty has dropped hugely in recent years. The places where it's still bad and where it may even be increasing, it's a handful of countries in the Middle East. So it's Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. That's it. And that's the core of it.
Syria.
The different.
Well, they of course have it. It doesn't seem that it's not even relevant to talk about death penalty in the context of what's going on in Syria. But Libya and Egypt have stopped, basically. Egypt had a few this year, and they sentenced a whole load of people to death. But they've actually only had a few executions since 2011, and so we don't know where they're going with it. And Libya have stopped since 2011. The countries in North Africa have stopped. Jordan, Lebanon, have largely stopped. I don't know when the last one in Lebanon was, but Jordan has been a long time. So even there's like very significant change. In Europe, it's disappeared entirely. In most of Africa, and I've watched this for 20 years. I remember looking at when I started following this issue, the majority of countries in the world were still executing, and now it's less than 20%. So it's a great success story, and I say it cuts across those cultural lines and geographic lines. It's quite remarkable, and I'd give it another. Even in this country, I'd give it another 10 years.
I agree. I think in 10 years we won't have it at all. And by the way, I just want to say something on it because I used to believe in the death penalty conceptually, and I was called in for a jury for the Cheshire home invasion. I don't know if you know this case. We had a couple of guys went into a home, raped and pillaged and murdered a mother and her daughter and burned the house down. And I was called in as they couldn't find a jury for many weeks, 12 people that could deal with it. And I told the judge, I've got holidays coming, and he says, well, he looks at the calendar and he goes, Rosh Hashanah. He says, all right, we won't have proceedings on Rosh Hashanah. They were desperate to get a jury in town. And then he goes, Yom Kippur. I said, well, Your Honor, Yom Kippur I can't do because, I got services, and I'm going through all the holidays of September, I'm like, but I said I'd love to do it, but, just the month doesn't work for me. And finally, the court was like in a shutdown for 6 days to get me they needed their last guy on the jury. I think it was the 5th week of jury selection. And finally, the judge says, and I said, okay, well, it looks like I'm going to be on the jury. And then he says to me, well, this is a death penalty case. I said to myself at that moment, because we've been killing innocent, we have evidence now that we've killed innocent people in this country. Many, and more are coming out now with DNA testing, and I'm sure everybody reads it. So I've changed my views on the death penalty. I said to the judge, I said, I have to be honest about my overlapping sense of judgment, because as a Jew, the burden of proof from a rabbinical Talmudic sense is much higher than what America considers. We don't take circumstantial evidence. I wouldn't trust the video footage. It would have to be testimony of human beings. It's much, much higher burden of proof. And I said, in a jury, I'm not sure if I was having to make a judgment, what I would use as my judgment. Would I follow American law as a religious person? Would I follow my religious conviction? And therefore have a higher standard for conviction, knowing that my verdict would ultimately possibly result in the death of the defendant. The defendant was standing right there, and I saw a smile break out on his lawyer's face because they're standing next to the defendant, thinking, okay, we finally have a guy who, maybe get my guy off the hook.
And
the judge says to me, Rabbi, get the hell out of here. So basically, it's over. And I didn't do it. But I think you're right. I think within 10 years, there's a shrunk bus. That's my personal opinion. You won't have one. But I just want to say one thing to what you said about that American waterboarding in this country, because as an American, I think it's important to remember that we did some terrible things in this country. I think we obviously are dealing with it, but there's so many layers to that the people that the CIA was possibly waterboarding and the reasons for it, and not to excuse it, torture at any level, but probably very, very different than the circumstances that go on and the violations that go on around the world. Besides the fact that we've self-critiqued, they can continuously do that. It's similar to saying, well, there's no death penalty in Syria, but 250,000 innocent people have been slaughtered in the country. And so I think you're right that no one is immune to what you're doing, and America is probably moving away from the death penalty because of international pressure. But there's a difference between killing somebody who, killed 5 children and hanging a guy in Iran for, committing adultery. There's such a, and we should take that, I think, into consideration when we think about it. Or Syria not having a death penalty, but, they take people, take people's heads off in the street and leave them hanging. So it's a little bit of both, I guess. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question following up on that.
And by the way, so we're going to have anybody who did not ask a question, and then we're going to close it and let Professor Schabas relax, and then obviously if we want to continue the conversation, we'll turn the cameras off. So who else did not ask a question that would like to ask something? Ezra and Josh, and then we'll close the session. Yeah.
So to what extent do you think an international body that can apply pressure and has the ability to affect change has to focus on the worst abusers of human rights? Because like when we think about, let's say, the police force here in New Haven, where there's violent crime, they have to focus on that. There's limited resources. They're going to put their attention in that over, let's say, college students, under 21 drinking, let's say. So I think the same concept applies to human rights. When you have an international body that's judging, it doesn't have to look at the worst abusers first and then go in order.
Here's the problem. You're not going to have a credible system when you do that, because people will say, it's like they used to say, I don't know if people still say it, there probably are lots of people here in the United States who say, oh, well, your criminal justice system is supposed to apply to everybody, but basically the rich guys get off and the poor guys go to jail. That's the problem with doing that kind of a selection. You'll say, well, the police, well, why are you wasting your time in the middle-class neighborhoods? You should be going into the nasty neighborhoods where everybody's taking crack cocaine and all of that. And that won't be credible there, and it won't stand up either. I don't think that does work in the long run, that sort of approach of saying you're going to focus on the worst. Because then it just means you're giving some people an easy ride, and you end up, and then that always will play out by class, ethnicity, and it will discredit your system in the long run. I think now we're not talking about global politics, right? We're talking about New Haven and criminal justice here.
But if we concentrate on Israel, all that more simple.
I'm not talking about that for obvious reasons. Okay.
Well, can't the system be discredited also by not focusing on the worst? And
sure,
it can go both ways.
Sure. I'm not arguing for not focusing on the worst. I'm just saying, if you start saying, well, we're just going to focus on the worst, and the people who are sort of only got some problems will leave them alone. That's the beauty of this universal theory attribute, because everybody gets treated. I don't want to say everyone gets treated equally, but everyone gets a run at it. And it makes it a lot easier to go to Sri Lanka and to Burma and to China and to North Korea and say, smarten up, everybody's getting a dose of it, and if you don't like it, and if you think it's unfair, you can read what they did to the United States and the United Kingdom, and they're all getting it. And it's stronger because of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Those systems definitely give more legitimacy.
And final question here.
Right. I don't want to regurgitate that point too much, but it seems like consistency and absolute consistency is key to the long-term viability of such a system. But when that's offset by these immediate threats of large-scale and widespread human rights abuse, my question is, there's certainly intermingling of ethical and tactical considerations. I think we're very clear on the ethical side and how it's hard to make these distinctions. But tactically, why is it the case, for instance, that like a Northern European country doesn't have the efficacy that the United States might have in going to human rights abusers, even though they have more of a consistent, viable human rights history than maybe a Western country? It seems to me that at the end of the day, it's a question of carrots and sticks, and hard and soft power, and less a matter of appealing to these notions of double standards. In the way that you would go to Sri Lanka, it doesn't really seem to be the case that Sri Lanka would be fundamentally more willing to do something simply because the party going to them has a history that's consistent with that ask.
We're talking about a whole lot of types of initiatives from different sources. I don't think anybody really knows what works best or better, and I don't think I do. I just try to do what has to be done and try to make it as fair and balanced as possible. But it's a work, like I said, it's a work in progress. Has wonderful beginnings, as I tried to demonstrate at the beginning of my talk, and we got to keep making it stronger. And everything. I forgot to mention, I should tell you something that I mentioned Henri Cassin, who's someone who fascinates me and for whom I have great admiration. I don't think there's a town in Paris that doesn't have a school named after Henri Cassin. You know, he's all over the place. And we have an NGO, there's a Jewish human rights NGO in London called Henri Cassin. And I'm on the board of advisors of that organization. And it intervenes in different areas. It's interested in treatment of refugees and so on. There are a number of issues where it's developed an expertise and maintaining and you know, protecting that great tradition that starts with Lauterbach and Cassin and Lemkin in terms of human rights. So.
It's excellent. Thank you. Okay, so. Thank you.